What if the Wild West didn't begin with cowboys and cattle drives, but with a man who turned the Civil War into a personal frontier of revenge? What if, years ago, the lawlessness we identify with gunmen and outlaws was already present? Traveling Tennessee's back roads with a rifle and a list of names, he did not wear a badge. He did not ride with an army in formation. He did not fight for glory, rank, or applause. He fought because the frontier taught him that survival belonged to the hardest man left standing. Champ Ferguson carried the Old West into the Civil War long before the West had a name. He was born in 1821 in a place where the border between law and violence barely existed. Eastern Tennessee was not a quiet countryside. It was a land of steep hills, scattered farms, bitter feuds, and memories that never died. Justice there was personal. Insults lasted generations, and blood once spilled was expected to be answered. Champ Ferguson grew up learning that the man who hesitated did not live long. He learned that a rifle was more reliable than a court. He learned that honor was something you defended yourself. By the time America fractured in 1861, Ferguson was already a product of frontier thinking. The Civil War did not create him. It simply gave him permission. When the war came, East Tennessee became one of the most divided regions in the country. Families split overnight. Neighbors became enemies. Unionists and Confederates lived side by side, each convinced the other was a traitor. This was not a place for grand battles. This was a place for ambushes, for midnight visits, for men who vanished into the woods and returned with blood on their hands. Champ Ferguson chose the Confederate side, but his war was never clean. He did not march under flags. He hunted. He became a guerrilla fighter, operating outside formal command, answering only to his own sense of loyalty and revenge. He rode the backcountry like a frontier outlaw, armed, mounted, and relentless. He knew the ridges. He knew the hollows. He knew which doors to knock on after dark. To Ferguson, the war was not blue against gray. It was personal names, personal grudges, old insults waiting for an excuse. He targeted men he believed supported the Union. Some were soldiers, many were not. Some were neighbors he had known for years. Witnesses later said he often called out names before firing, not to warn them, to ensure they understood the reason behind their demise. This was Old West violence before the Old West existed. No trial, no surrender, no second chances. Ferguson gained a reputation quickly. Fear traveled faster than any army. People whispered his name the way frontier towns would later whisper about outlaws. Doors were barred at night. Men slept with rifles beside their beds. Union supporters fled the countryside when they heard he was nearby. Others stayed and prayed he wouldn't remember them. He rode with other guerrillas at times, but he was never truly part of any group. Ferguson was a lone force, unpredictable, driven. Even Confederate officers were uneasy around him. He was useful, but he was dangerous. The frontier had taught him something armies never could. Rules slow you down. Mercy gets you killed. Stories spread of men shot after surrendering, of prisoners executed instead of exchanged, of killings carried out not in battle, but at close range. The line between soldier and murderer blurred until it disappeared completely. As the war dragged on, Ferguson's violence escalated. He didn't slow down as hope faded. He accelerated. When Confederate fortunes declined, his war intensified. The more desperate the cause became, the more personal his actions grew. This was not ideology anymore. This was survival through dominance. By 1864, Union forces controlled much of the region. Confederate authority was collapsing. Guerrillas like Ferguson were becoming liabilities. But Ferguson did not retreat. He did not adapt. He kept riding. When the war ended in 1865, most men laid down their arms. Champ Ferguson did not. He believed the end of the war did not erase what had been done. He believed frontier justice still applied. That belief sealed his fate. Union authorities arrested Ferguson not as a soldier, but as a criminal, not for fighting, for murder. His trial shocked even a nation exhausted by war. Witness after witness testified to executions carried out without battle. Men killed after surrender. Men shot at point-blank range. Men dragged from their homes. Ferguson did not deny the killings. He defended them. He said they were enemies. He said war justified his actions. He said he had only done what frontier men had always done. But the war was over, and the country wanted an end to that kind of violence. In October 1865, Champ Ferguson was sentenced to death. He was hanged shortly afterward. He did not die as a Confederate hero. He did not die as a Union villain. He died as something else entirely. A man out of time. A frontier killer standing in a country trying to move on. Champ Ferguson's story matters because he represents a bridge between eras, between the Civil War and the Wild West, between organized armies and outlaw violence. The lawlessness we associate with later gunslingers did not appear overnight. It was already there. It had been practiced, perfected. Men like Ferguson carried it forward. After the war, the country pushed west. Veterans returned home hardened. Weapons were everywhere. Authority was thin. The frontier became a place where personal justice thrived again, where men settled disputes with gunfire, where reputation meant survival. Champ Ferguson did not live to see the Wild West take shape, but his methods did. The idea that a man could decide guilt himself, that violence could be justified by belief, that fear could replace law. Those ideas followed settlers west. Ferguson is uncomfortable history. He doesn't fit neatly into hero or villain. He forces us to confront how thin the line was between soldier and outlaw. He reminds us that the Old West was not born in saloons and shootouts. It was born in blood-soaked borderlands where rules collapsed. The Civil War did not end violence in America. It relocated it, and men like Champ Ferguson were the carriers. They showed what happens when frontier justice meets national conflict, when personal revenge is given political cover, when war removes restraint instead of imposing order. The Old West would later romanticize the gunman, but Ferguson shows the darker origin, the version without legends, without redemption. Just a man riding hard country, convinced he was right, leaving silence behind him. That is how the Old West entered the Civil War, and how it survived long after the guns fell silent.